50%. That was the share of America's most advanced missile interceptors, THAAD and Patriot, expended in just 38 days of war with Iran. In that same brief window, hundreds of Tomahawk missiles vanished from U.S. stockpiles, their production lines unable to keep pace. The White House insisted that Iran's military was decimated, its navy at the bottom of the sea, its air force functionally irrelevant. But deep inside the Pentagon, a classified assessment told a different story. One that Congress read in black and white, and one that the public was never meant to see. If half of Iran's missiles and two-thirds of its air force remain intact, if the Straits of Hormuz are mined and could take 6 months to clear, what does that mean for U.S. power in the region and for everyone who depends on it? What if the war that was supposed to prove American dominance instead exposed its limits? The numbers are not abstract. They are the difference between deterrence and disaster, between a global economy that moves and one that seizes up overnight. In the Pentagon's own words, Iran retains thousands of missiles and drones capable of threatening U.S. and partner forces throughout the region. That reality, delivered under oath to Congress, stands in jarring contrast to the public declarations of victory. The tension between what was claimed and what was actually achieved is not just a matter for historians, it is the unstable ground beneath every future decision in the region. If questions like this one are the kind you find yourself turning over long after the story ends, you are exactly the audience this work is made for. Subscribing takes a moment and ensures the next story finds you. And when you finish listening, leave a thought in the comments. The conversation that happens there often reveals what matters most. Before the first missiles flew, Washington believed it understood the limits of Iranian power. For years, the consensus had been that the U.S. could, if necessary, dismantle Iran's military infrastructure with precision strikes and overwhelming force. The Defense Intelligence Agency briefed closed-door committees. Iran's arsenal was formidable, but its systems were aging, its supply chain stretched thin by sanctions, its ability to project power no match for America's. There was confidence that any escalation could be contained, that the U.S. would always have escalation dominance, the ability to respond at a higher level than any adversary, and to dictate the pace and outcome of any confrontation. This doctrine was not just theory. It was the unspoken assumption behind every deployment, every carrier group stationed in the Gulf, every diplomatic demand issued from the Situation Room. Allies in the region, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, relied on this American backstop. Oil tankers moved through the Straits of Hormuz under the invisible shield of U.S. power. The global economy functioned because it could, until the day that shield was tested and the numbers began to tell a different story. The first sign that the world was shifting did not arrive with a bang, but with a report. At 8:30 a.m. on a humid Monday, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency submitted a written statement to the House Armed Services Committee. The language was clinical, but the meaning was unmistakable. Iran could still inflict significant damage, and its arsenal remained a direct threat. Quietly, the report detailed that thousands of Iranian missiles and attack drones survived the initial barrage. The White House, caught off guard, moved swiftly to control the narrative. Official spokespeople declared that the Iranian military had been crushed in 38 days, that its navy was annihilated, its air force irrelevant, its missile launchers destroyed. But inside the Pentagon, officers reviewed the numbers. Half of Iran's ballistic missiles remained. 60% of the Revolutionary Guard's naval arm was still afloat. Two-thirds of the Air Force, battered but operational, could still threaten vital choke points. That assumption that overwhelming force would erase Iran's deterrent was wrong. What they did not know yet was already in motion. By noon, the first whispers began to circulate among analysts in Washington. What if the war had not actually ended on American terms? The contradiction between public triumph and private alarm deepened as the numbers came in. According to CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, an institution whose assessments are taken seriously in every defense briefing, half of the United States' most advanced missile interceptors were gone. 50% of THAAD and Patriot systems had been used, along with 45% of precision strike missiles and nearly a third of Tomahawks. The production timelines were grim. Only one facility in the U.S. could manufacture Tomahawks, and it faced chronic shortages of rare earth minerals. Replenishing these arsenals would take years, not months. At 2:15 p.m., a senior Pentagon official confided to a reporter, "Absent nuclear weapons and ground troops, we held nothing back." The full weight of American air power and precision munitions had been brought to bear. Yet Iran's core capabilities endured. The war's cost was measured not only in billions of dollars, but in something far more destabilizing: the sudden public exposure of American vulnerability. That window was closing faster than anyone realized. In the Gulf, U.S. allies began to question whether the shield they had relied on still existed. The trap had been set weeks earlier, when Iranian planners, anticipating a campaign of overwhelming strikes, dispersed key assets, used Chinese-made decoys to draw fire, and held back enough real capacity to ensure that even a battered force could still threaten the oil lifeline of the world. What came next would prove that everything the analysts had assumed about this situation was built on a foundation that was already crumbling. As the ceasefire settled, the Pentagon faced a new dilemma. Intelligence showed that the Straits of Hormuz had been seeded with naval mines. For days, U.S. officials insisted it was a bluff. Only 8, maybe 13 mines, nothing the Navy could not handle. But an internal assessment delivered to Congress painted a grimmer picture. Clearing the straits could take up to 6 months. At 4:17 p.m., President Trump issued a public order. U.S. Navy ships were to shoot and kill any Iranian boats in the area, no hesitation. The statement was more than bluster. It marked a new phase of escalation. The risk was not hypothetical. 6 months without oil flowing through the straits would send global prices to $250, perhaps $300 a barrel. Gasoline at $6 a gallon in the U.S. Blackouts and rationing in Japan and Australia. Starvation and energy collapse in Africa and South Asia. The entire global system, for decades kept afloat by the assumption of American control in the Gulf, now faced the possibility of prolonged paralysis. Every tanker delayed, every mine that remained, was another day the system teetered closer to the edge. In the war rooms of Washington and Riyadh, the realization dawned: the tools that once guaranteed stability were now stretched to their limits. The momentum had shifted. Iran, battered but unbroken, held the power to inflict pain not just on the U.S., but on the world. The cost asymmetry was brutal. A handful of mines, a few thousand missiles, a navy reduced but not erased, could trigger losses measured in the trillions. That was the new reality. The false summit arrived when the White House declared victory. Spokespeople reeled off numbers. 159 Iranian ships sunk, the Navy destroyed, the Air Force shattered. But as the classified briefings reached Congress, a different ledger emerged. Iranian forces had lost deeply, but not fatally. The U.S. had fired off half its strategic munitions and exposed its own dependency on fragile supply chains. The Pentagon's own figures, quietly amended, revealed that even the human costs had been underreported. 15 wounded American service members were erased from the casualty list. A cover-up, some called it. What looked like a victory was actually an exposure. The illusion of dominance had lasted just long enough for the world to watch. That single decision set off a chain of events that most observers still have not fully mapped, and the consequences are still unfolding today. The breaking point came not with a final strike, but with an order. At 6:08 p.m., U.S. minesweepers began their hazardous work. Only 3 ships, all recently decommissioned, were available. Newer technology could help, but the threat from Iranian drones made the task fraught. Every hour spent clearing mines was an hour of risk for global commerce. The Pentagon's report forecasted 6 months before normal traffic could resume. Oil prices surged. U.S. allies demanded guarantees. The administration offered none. The president, in a final act of escalation, ordered operations to triple in intensity. Iranian commanders, reading the same public reports, saw an opportunity. Their forces, still capable of launching missiles and drones, prepared for the next phase. The trap was now visible to all. The U.S. could not escalate further without risking open-ended war. Iran could not be dislodged from the straits without a full-scale invasion, a scenario even the most hawkish voices in Washington considered catastrophic. There would be no second chance to correct this. Every decision now carried the weight of irreversible consequence. The accounting that followed was sobering. The U.S., by its own estimates, expended munitions worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Stockpiles that were supposed to last through any contingency had been halved. Production bottlenecks made rapid replenishment impossible. For allies like Japan and South Korea, who had given up their own defenses in reliance on the American shield, the revelation was existential. Israel's stockpiles of interceptors, already strained, now depended on a resupply chain that could not deliver. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, left exposed, began to reconsider their strategic bets. Iran, for its part, suffered real losses. Thousands of targets struck, industrial sites destroyed, leadership decimated. But its core capacity remained. The ability to close the straits, to deter invasion, to threaten regional adversaries all survived. The war's greatest casualty was not a ship or a plane, but the consensus that had governed the region for decades. In Washington, the search for scapegoats began. Procurement officials, Navy secretaries, congressional committees all faced questions for which there were no easy answers. What was lost was not just materiel, but the aura of invincibility. The events that never happened, an uncontested American victory, a lasting deterrent, were now impossible. What echoes in the end is not the exchange of missiles or the clash of ships, but the principle that stands revealed. Power, once exposed as finite, cannot be easily reassembled. The world functions on assumptions about who can act, who can deter, who can escalate without fear. When those assumptions collapse, the consequences ripple outwards, touching every market, every government, every household that depends on stability in distant waters. The question worth sitting with is not whether these events were avoidable, but whether any system built on the illusion of inexhaustible power can long endure. How would you weigh the risks if you were in the room making these decisions? Share your perspective. Every angle matters when the stakes are this high.